I should point out ahead of time that this is a talk that I could probably talk about for about 2 hours, so this is going to be very much a whistle-stop tour through it, so if there is anything that doesn't make sense, then please come and grab me afterwards. So the topic of this is Better Together and how to build a mobile game with help from your community. So really what this 15-minute segment is going to be is kind of making the case for why you should do that and involving a community early in development. And we'll touch on kind of 4 major areas: why we decided to do it, how we put our plan into action, what we found out as a result, and when to use and when not to use this. So first of all, I just want to caveat that early here, we're not talking early access or beta. Those kind of terms are now used for kind of pre-launches, and that process is already really well defined, and there are lots of talks about that. We're actually talking super early in your development process. And when I'm talking about community, for us, that's really a well-defined group of players that kind of exist within an existing brand. That can be your brand or it can be someone else's brand. But really what we mean is any kind of group of players that can be identified by kind of core likes or something that they share. So first of all, who are CCP? So we are an Icelandic game company. We are most recognized for our sandbox MMO called EVE Online, which has been running for about 15 years. We've recently been acquired by Pearl Abyss, which is a Korean MMO development studio which creates Black Desert Online. And I'm here because we established a London office in 2016, and the focus of that London office is primarily to look at mobile development. And that kind of task is to bring kind of the EVE brand to mobile. So why are we talking about engaging with the community so early? So I just want to kind of be upfront that there was no kind of psychic vision or clairvoyance involved in this. We took a punt on it and it turned out good for us. We didn't go into this expecting how good the results would be. So the major 2 areas why we wanted to go into it was community buy-in, first of all. So EVE Online has a huge community already, and we wanted to make sure that when we're moving into a kind of a new product line that we're building trust around that expansion. When it comes to mobile, there's a lot of speculation around business model and the impact on the MMO. So we wanted to make sure that we were kind of coming out ahead of all of that and having the conversations with our community up front. And also, our community is also now what we consider our brand experts. They've been playing this game for 15 plus years. Most of us who work at the company haven't been there that long. So when we're doing something new, we like to go in there and engage their input. And secondly to that, we want to kind of trial innovative features. So we're kind of really looking here for a qualitative validation of the whole kind of approach that we're taking to this game. We were kind of creating a game with a social strategy kind of feel to it, but we wanted to go really heavy in on that social. And so we wanted to kind of identify how far we could push the social elements right from the very first session with the game, and if that was too high potentially for a mobile audience. So I think it's also important to talk about things that we weren't looking for. So at this point, in an early playtest, we weren't looking for KPI measurements. At this point in the game, the systems are just too underdeveloped to be able to take proper KPIs out of it. And also, the community that we were targeting is not representative of the full kind of mobile marketplace. So soft launch really remains the best time to gather this information. We also weren't looking to kind of have an overall green light as a result of this test. The breadth of the information that we were getting back from our community wasn't going to be wide enough for us to make the call whether we should go forwards or not go forwards with this project. And really enough development time still remained that if we did get bad sentiment back, we could actually turn the project around or do something a bit different with it. And last of all, we weren't looking for kind of feedback on balance, bugs, and polish. Again, development at this early stage wasn't focusing on these particular areas of the game. However, we did know that this was going to be a challenge not to get our community to focus on this because generally players are most comfortable providing feedback on these particular areas. So the kind of key takeaway there is it's really important when you're doing these tests to kind of manage expectations with all of the stakeholders, both internally and externally. So kind of moving on to how we actually did it. So the first thing that we did was to kind of identify our audience. We had an idea of who your game is for is kind of super important at this stage, and it's ideal if you can back it up with market research, but if that's not possible and we know that those resources aren't available to everyone, then it's possible to kind of evaluate existing audiences out there and say, okay, well, our community is a bit like the community that exists in this game. It's also important to be able to locate the community hubs and understand where your audience gathers. We actually used EVE Vegas, which is our fan gathering that happens in Vegas every year. So we used a physical kind of gathering location, but a virtual one would work just as well. And we made sure that up front that we were communicating our expectations really well. We kind of spoke to our audience and tested the water a little bit before we went ahead and did this, and made sure that there were enough people who were generally interested in partaking with it. And then the last thing I think is important is that with any kind of play test early on, it's important to be respectful of people's time. You're asking them for feedback on a game that's very unfinished and ready and polished. So it's kind of easy to slip into a place where you're flippant, trying to kind of say, well, what do you know? You're only a player, you're not a game maker. But really you have to take that step back and understand that they're there to help you make this thing better. In terms of preparation, we made sure that we were collecting emails super early. So having an understanding of the volume and how many players were going to be in the playtest really helped us to kind of understand what our limitations would be. We had that contact list then that we could then send out updates on the playtest, and we had it for an emergency as well in case things went wrong. But as with all gathering of personal information, it's important at this point to remember that since the end of last year, GDPR is a big consideration, and you need to be able to understand what you can and what you can't do with that data. So knowing the limitations of what you and your development team can do is really important. We plan to invite the players into waves in the game, because if you invite everyone together, there's the potential then for a crash if there's overwhelming interest in the game. And having that bad initial experience will really hurt the engagement with it and put a bias and a spin on everything that you're gathering after that point. And if at all possible, have playtesters be incentivized to kind of take place in your playtest. If you create an event with your game that has kind of an achievable goal, that really works. It can be a cooperative goal or it can be a competitive role. We were lucky enough to be partnered with Samsung at the time, so they provided us a few phones that we could give away as tangible prizes, and so that was a really good kind of way of getting people's interest piqued right from the beginning with this playtest. For platform distribution, we made the choice to use everyone's personal devices. This wasn't kind of a light choice to make, but we decided that by letting people use their own phones, we would maximize the engagement across the people who were at the event. But we did do that with eyes wide open, knowing that people's experiences would vary depending on their phone. But we did want players to be able to play the game while having their own phones and using it as they would be using a normal phone. We didn't think that we'd get a realistic piece of feedback if we were inviting players just to play it for 20 minutes on a bank of phones with other players. We used both iOS and Android, again, because we wanted to kind of reach as many people as possible. And it really adds up to making your project feel inclusive right from the start. If you tell half of your player base that you can't partake in a player base very early on, then you stand upsetting half of that user base, and they might then kind of react negatively in future playtests. If you're using a Unity engine or if you're using an Unreal Engine, this is actually a lot of the heavy lifting for this has been done for you, so it isn't too much of a stretch of both SKUs working at the same time. In terms of distribution, we use TestFlight and Google Play Beta. There was, those systems now are quite developed, and they do a lot of the hard work in managing to get the build out to players if you've got their email addresses. But the initial setup can still be pretty complex, so I definitely recommend practicing kind of internally distributing your build through these systems before you go ahead and do the actual playtest. In terms of collecting feedback, we set up social channels. We had in-game chat, but that's kind of too momentary. So what we decided to do is that we'd use Discord. A lot of people are familiar with that now, so it's a natural place for people to go and share their feelings about a game. And also it means that the moment-to-moment reactions are recorded, and we can go back after the playtest and kind of study exactly what people said as they were getting to grips with the game. We also created a feedback survey using Typeform, and that was kind of asking sentiments about the game itself, but we also asked a lot of questions about the player, because it always helps to have context about the kind of players that you're talking about. So when you're reading why they like or they didn't like something, you can tell if they're part of your audience or what segment of your audience you need to change to make those people happy. We also distributed that towards the end of the event, just before it finished. So that way, the game is it's on people's minds still, but they're not kind of making early judgments of it before they've had a chance to get to grips with the game. So I think it's important just to mention at this point that feelings, all the data that we're looking at from the feedback, the feelings kind of outperform hard data. At this point, we're looking for emotional responses. And even though some general kind of behavior or data can be useful, like session lengths, or engagement with specific features, what's most important is that you're getting that general sentiment and that feedback towards your game as a whole. I think in terms of the build that you're providing, I think having a coherent experience is a bare minimum for anything that you're putting out there. And it's kind of an intuitive core loop should be present. If your game is just bits and pieces, then players aren't going to get it without a lot of hand-holding and documentation, and that's not what you want to do for a playtest. You should also be trying to minimize high-profile bugs and crashes. And also areas where you're just not going to have time to finish creating builds. I recommend using wireframes better than low-quality assets. And the reason for this is that players obviously won't know themselves what is there because it's finished or what is there just because it's not good enough. And you want players to know where you haven't finished something or when extra polish is coming. So wireframes do a much better job than that, than doing kind of a low-quality version. I'd also highly recommend a game that has a kind of a social toolkit in there. So we had kind of chat in there and a push notification system. And so that allows our developers to actually be in there in the chat and talk to the players and provide some very early first-time user experience to players without actually having to develop in the game, which then kind of increases the speed at which you can bring this playtest to the community. And also what we found is that players actually assist each other with issues, and that where there are problems or there are things that aren't easily understandable, players actually then kind of group up with each other, and that kind of builds a really nice virtuous circle within the game and the community itself. I also highly recommend building an emergency response plan. This is an early playtest after all, things will go wrong. We did actually investigate having kind of out-of-hours support for it because we were running the playtest in Las Vegas and the development team was in Europe. And we kind of had planned for a graceful failure strategy. So in the event that something catastrophic went wrong and we couldn't continue the playtest, the build, we had a switch that we could flip that basically presented a message that said, you know, we're sorry, the build has gone down at the moment. We thank you for your input, and then push them towards the feedback areas. This picture here is actually at the top of one of the Ferris wheels in Las Vegas, and I put it in here because the emergency response plan we actually had to put into action while we were all on the top of this. So there was like 6 of us with our laptops out, not looking out the window at all, trying to fix this playtest build. So that's kind of how we actually did it. Running it like onto what we didn't expect and that we actually got out of the playtest was we were really amazed at kind of the actionable data that we generated. So we got a crazy amount of edge case QA examples. Players are being players and the EVE Online audience being the EVE Online audience. They discovered crazy fantastical issues that you could do. This picture here is how everyone who was playing it decided that they'd all spam one place at exactly the same time, which put an insane load on the servers. And that actually brought out loads of systematic flaws with our engineering approach, which we hadn't imagined before, which then resulted in a far more robust architecture going forward as we developed the game. It also gave us a sneak peek at scaling. So as I said, we had way more concurrent players than expected, and that created some performance issues and minor downtimes. But what we did get out of that was learnings on how to spin up the kind of cloud services in real time. And also, we got performance data on real devices. As we said, we used everyone's real phones, and so the breadth of data that we got was much wider than we expected, and we saw that in some cases we had a kind of significant battery drain and overheating issue, which then we kind of put into our schedule to make sure that we were focusing on performance. And we actually added a system in there where the game would automatically dial down the graphics settings on kind of lower devices. One of the really interesting things that we had back was that a player came to us and during the test, and he said he thought that he'd, after the test had happened, he thought I'd solved one of our performance issues. And we were like, oh, great, he's a coder. He's going to have provided some really interesting insight into our code. But actually what it did is just mounted the phone onto a heatsink and solved the problem that way, which is not a particularly scalable way to solve our overpower issues. The other thing that we got, which didn't expect, was kind of enthusiasm at a large scale. We got massive buy-in from hardcore PC players. We didn't expect that. We got EVE Online's kind of hardcore player base to ask if they could import their entire corporations in one go. We had some real-life confrontations over the loss in the game, and they were all pretty good-natured with kind of banter and teasing kind of happening at the event itself. But also we found out that players were kind of meeting up for better coordination of how to play with each other. We got mass requests to extend the playtest, so it was just 3 days to begin with. We ended up running it for about 9 months. And we had kind of internally, we had a really huge level of internal development support. So without us asking, the entire team stayed up for 48 hours to support the build. And that kind of created a really good camaraderie between the team, and also it gave the whole wider team a much better understanding of the players that they were aiming this game for. So why did we keep the game running for 9 months? So the benefits were still massively significant. Many players were really engaged with the game and investing a lot of their time into it. We had a positive feedback cycle between the developers and the players on Discord. They were talking to each other on a daily basis about what they liked, what they didn't like, where their problems were. And that stream of QA data on client performance and server stability was still in there. So again, really useful data as we carried on managing. It was also, should say that it was also very manageable to support this game. We had updates to the playtest every milestone internally. So that was once every 3 months we updated the game. And spending time on pre-production on technical debt made this possible because it made that there weren't issues that we had to be fixing at a regular cadence. And also we maintained the population of several hundred. We didn't actually go above that at this point because we thought as soon as we start having thousands of players in here, that's going to negatively impact how we do it. And one thing that we did do is we regularly had status feedback sessions on this to make sure that everyone was still aligned, no one's time was being drained on working on the playtest, and we all understood that if at any point in time we felt that the playtest was negatively impacting our ability to develop a quality game, then we would stop the playtest. So I've talked about a lot of these advantages in kind of separate areas, but really the main advantage is that these are all kind of indicators of the more holistic benefit of having the early playtest, which is uncovering your golden cohort. So knowing exactly who your golden cohort is, and by that I mean the players that are your super enthusiasts, the one that are going to put hours and hours in every day, who are going to talk about it, who are going to be the real champions for your game. Once you know that, it allows you to kind of accelerate your marketing reach when you actually go live with the game. It promotes organic virality by having them talk about it and have a social media footprint. It also reduces the time that you get to social critical mass, which means that if your game is social-based and you need a certain amount of players for the whole loops to work, if you have your golden cohort in there from the start, then you can get to that point much quicker. It also allows the full player development cycle to be in place as soon as you hit soft launch. If the playtest is still running, or you've got a group of people who know how to play the game, from day one on your soft launch, you're going to have a group of experts in that game who are going to provide aspirational goals for your new players coming into it. It makes the game world feel alive if you've got a kind of a mobile game with an MMO flavor. And it also kind of breeds your social leaders, the people who are going to start your guilds and your clans and going to be inviting people and educating people. What it also did was provide us mentors. We actually had players coming to us if they could ask to be part of a mentoring system. And what that was really good for was plugging gaps in the first-time user experience where we didn't have time yet to implement the full thing. Which then goes on and reduces the churn out of your game in soft launch due to potential confusion areas. And the mentoring itself gives those players who are your golden cohort a real sense of feeling of belonging in your game, which will then keep them around longer as well. So we talked about how to run an early playtest. I just want to talk very briefly on how to ruin an early playtest. So these are kind of 4 areas where you should not take this process kind of under consideration if you're not willing to do these 4 things. So first one, if you don't know who your target audience is, you're really going to struggle with this. This is not a system for finding who your target audience is. You need a reasonably good idea of where they are to begin with. If you don't know that, then the feedback and the data that you're getting back from this system might not be valid. You might not actually be telling yourself the answers to the questions you want. So number 2, if you're not prepared to act on the feedback, there is still kind of healthy skepticism in some areas, or unhealthy skepticism, I should say, that non-developers can provide meaningful feedback to game development. And also that, some people with their game are just fully committed to following through a vision that they've got in their head through to launch. If that's you and you're not prepared to be willing to act on the feedback you're getting from this playtest, then perhaps this isn't a system that you should be using. Likewise, if you don't have the resources to act upon the feedback, if you've got hard time constraints on your project, or your team is small enough that there's just no bandwidth to support it, you should really think about doing this, because if it's going to have a heavy impact on your development, then you could be kind of shooting yourself in the foot before getting any value out of it. And then I touched on this last one a little bit, but if you're expecting this to provide full validation for your game, this isn't what's going to happen. You're going to get some qualitative information back that will help steer you in the right direction, but you're not going to get a green light, you're not going to get KPIs. So it's important that if there's people expecting that from you, that you kind of don't go into this with your eyes kind of closed and realize that you're not going to get that information back from it. So kind of just providing a recap of everything. So in summary, what I'm really trying to get to is that if you engage your community early in development, you can get some benefits in some real areas. So number 1, you can make smart, informed decisions. You can provide your designers with qualitative feedback in time to make meaningful changes to your game. You can verify that you understand your audience and that you're targeting the right people. You can better prepare your team for the realities of running a live game. Essentially, while you're doing this process, you'll be doing development and running a live game at the same time. Now, even though you're doing it at a much smaller scale, that process gives you a lot of insight into how you're going to split your team, and when issues happen on one side or the other, how you resolve those and where you funnel your users. It also improves kind of the awareness that the team has of the audience they're making for, and usually this is something that a PM has a strong kind of understanding of, but we really found a benefit when the whole team fully understands the audience and the game that they're making. And it also provides a lot of familiarity on the release management process, which can be complex to set up, and again, it's much better to kind of go through those kind of pains when you're in a much smaller audience. And the last one of all is being able to jumpstart your game's community. So, as I mentioned, it breeds your mentors and your super enthusiasts that are deeply invested in your game. And it also helps to kind of minimize any negative sentiment with a lack of product information. So this is especially important for companies who are moving into the mobile area from kind of PC or console. Sometimes players will have a kind of preconceptions about what mobile is and the business models and free to play or pay to win and all those things. You can get that out of the way quite early with a game playtest like this. And again, it will support and multiply the impact of any marketing activities that you engage in from that point onwards. So as I said, super fast whistle-stop tour of this. I could talk for this for ages, so if there's any other questions about it in detail, then please let me know. I'm kind of running slightly over here, so I'm not sure if we've got time for questions or...
Maybe we can take one if anyone has a quick question. I'll take this one, this gentleman in the front row.
Sam, you talked about the golden cohort. Was there a specific way that you tried to ensure that sample, because it was from the fan festival, so was there a certain way that you ensured that sample was going to be representative of outside of that golden cohort, or did you have any fears that that potentially your sample was not going to be representative of what the wider opportunity could be?
Exactly, and that was kind of one of our bigger worries kind of coming out of that, and that we got all of this good information and all of this optimistic feel about the game. However, that kind of question was always in the back of our heads as well, is this just, how big is this golden cohort, and is this just a very small number of people who are very invested in kind of EVE Online who are getting into this? So we took this information and then we kind of did a bit of market research of our own, and we kind of spread that out, and we used expert reviews from other people in the industry as well to kind of try and back that up. So it's always a hard thing to do, and to be honest, you're never really going to get full clarity on that until you soft launch the game and you get that really wide scale of input of players. But there are kind of some mitigation steps that you can do, and pretty much any other data point that you can get, whether it is experts or other companies that have done the same thing, or whether it's widening your bracket of the playtest a little bit, will help you kind of be more certain every time you do that.